Hello and welcome. I've been painting people in my sketchbook recently. I'm not sure if it's the isolation or what, but I do rather enjoy creating these little faces in my sketchbook. I didn't capture the drawing portion and I was feeling a bit bad for not showing that to you, but my excuse is that I was doing that in front of the TV, which probably accounts for why some of them are a bit wonkier than others. But to be honest, the wonky ones are often my favourite. Would you like to see? This is one of my little moleskin sketchbooks and it's about the perfect size, I reckon. I've done a few of them before in a past series. There they are. This was, maybe about a year ago. In fact, I think there's a video of one of these, one of the earlier videos in my channel. So I remembered that I'd done these and I wanted to have another go. They're so much fun. Look at the shadows. You see, I do love shadows so very, very much. And I think this one coming up, that's the one, there's a video for one of my earliest videos. So that's the sort of thing I'm working on. And that one, I actually sketched that out in the car waiting for the school kids, and it turned out to be one of the better sketches. These other ones are the ones I did in front of the TV, and that little lady's the one I painted first. I don't normally paint eyelashes, but I think she's an actress and that was backstage. And sometimes I lose a bit of the symmetry and the wonkiness because I'm in such a hurry to get on with the painting, but those are the ones I tend to love the best for some reason. They're almost a cross between a portrait and a caricature, so I don't know how pleased the actual people that I'm painting would be with my efforts, but I have to say it's a lot of fun. And this lady, she was an Unsplash photo reference. Let me show you what I'm working from. I do love her bright red beret, and hats can be a bit of a challenge to make them look like they're actually over the head and not just perched on the top like a little Mr. Men hat, so I do love a bit of a challenge there. And I'm trying to preserve the little highlight on her nose, but that doesn't often work very well in my sketchbook because the paper's okay. This is a watercolour moleskin sketchbook, so I do quite like the paper, but you certainly can't expect the same sort of results from this sketchbook paper as you would get if you were using proper watercolour paper or a big sheet or a block or a pad or anything like that. And I'm quite lucky to have a couple of flesh-like tones in my palette. I think that one's called Naples Red Yellow. And it's a nice pale base tone, and she was a very pale little lady. And I'm using another one of my favourite colours there to put in the shadows because I feel this colour works so well with flesh tones, and I'm a bit of a purple fan. That's a colour called Brilliant Red Violet by Schminky, and it plays so nicely with these sort of muted orangey peachy flesh tones. Another of my go-to colours is Burnt Sienna, which is what I'm using to put in the shadow side of her little face there. It's quite nice if you can get this first wash down all in one go before any of it dries, so that you can put the lighter colours next to the darker colours, next to the shadow colours, and let them all blend in naturally without making any of those edges and watermarks. I quite like the loose effect that you get of those. You know, it's kind of a relaxed, informal look when you do see those watermarks that that naturally happen if you're going to start layering up and try and build in extra skin tones over the top on this kind of paper. So I'm not too bothered about it, but I do find that I tend to prefer my results if I've managed to do most of this wet in wet, because I think wet in wet is perfect for skin where, especially youthful skin like this, where you don't have any hard edges. I mean, really, your hardest edges are going to be around her eyes and perhaps that edge of the highlight of her nose against the shadow side of her cheek. So apart from those, everything else is going to be lovely soft blends. And the same pink that I put in her cheeks, I want to add in other places. And it's typically the tip of our nose and our chin and the top of her forehead there as it recedes in space. And I've just noticed I've left the top of her eye, so there's a good chance, that's a bit annoying, that I might give myself a hard edge up there, where around the top of her eye by her eyebrow. Don't know why I left that bit out. Definite oversight. However, we might be lucky because that's her eyebrow there, which possibly will hide my little mistake. Anyway, let's not call them mistakes, let's call them happy accidents, shall we? Perhaps it's going to half paint her eyebrow for me. There's always hope, isn't there? Now let's pop in that gorgeous red beret. I always like to use more than one tone of a colour. It's so much more interesting and a little bit more realistic, because when you put just a single flat colour, things can take on a bit of a cartoonish look, and it kind of screams new painter, I think. So I've got a couple of reds in my palette. That's a scarlet red, and the other one that I will probably use is alizarin crimson, which is the warmer one. It's got a lot more blue in it, so it's going to be great for painting the bottom part of that beret as it curls under and there's a bit of a shadow between her head and the hat. And again, where it's nice and wet, that's going to blend smoothly for me and put in that curve kind of naturally, if I can try and leave that highlight there. And there are these little seams on her hat, which are quite a nice detail. If I can get the paint thick enough, by which I mean less water and more pigment, I should be able to put in those lines and they could stay reasonably distinct. I'll just have to see how it dries to see if I've managed to pull that off or not. So I want to let her face dry, and since I've already got red on my brush, let's go and do her rather charming red jumper. I'm only going to put in her sort of head and shoulders, so I'll just let the her jumper kind of fade off. And I've got lovely markings from that, the ribbing of her polo neck. And there's also the wrinkles that are there. So I'm going to use that same technique of putting in the more concentrated paint to try and keep those layers, those little lines that I'm going to add a little bit more distinct. And it's always worth remembering that you can take paint away as well as put it down. And it's a great way to lighten up a value, add a little highlight, and that's what I was wanting to do across the top of her shoulder there. So let's use some alizarin crimson and put in a few more details on that little neckline. It's really about her and her face and her hat, so I don't want to go to town too much, drawing too much focus to her clothing, but clothing is an awful lot of fun to paint. Folds and those rib textures can be so nice to try and suggest with the tip of the paintbrush. I've decided to leave this painting in real time rather than speeding it up, so you'll have to let me know in the comments if you prefer this or if you are wishing that I would get on with things so that you can just whiz through it and watch her little face come to life. If you're brand new to my channel, then thank you for clicking on this video and a very warm welcome to you. My name's Kerrie Woodhouse and I love watercolour. I post a new video every Wednesday, so if you like loose, expressive, colourful paintings, then this might just be for you. You might want to consider subscribing and turning on notifications if you want to be notified when I post the next video. Now, when I'm painting, I usually prefer to just mix the colours on the paper itself. I like to put two colours next to each other and let the paints decide how and where they should blend. But on this portrait, where I want to be a little bit more careful about the colours, I seem to be in a slightly more patient frame of mind, and I'm actually mixing up a darker colour. It's a combination of that purple colour I used on the top of her hairline, which is the brilliant red violet, and the burnt sienna, because I want a sort of deeper shadow colour to put behind the top of her eyelid. That's going to show us that her eye sockets recede away from us, the viewer. And she's also got a little bit of eyeshadow on, so I guess it is showing a little bit of that. I'm not going to put in all those details. I've also seemed to have drawn her little face terribly small. I think in the previous series that you might have noticed when I was flicking through my sketchbook in the beginning there, I had made the faces a bit bigger. And I think I'm going to try and do that with the next ones. In fact, I think there was some of the ones I'd sketched out were getting bigger and bigger. I think it was a confidence thing, because portraits can be fairly intimidating. They're one of my favourite things, and I talk about this a lot. So I've got a very detailed blog post, and it's even got 10 tips for beginner portrait artists if you are interested in doing this sort of thing. So have a look in the links of in the description of this video if you're interested in checking that out. And I think one of the most helpful tips if you're trying to sort of ease yourself into trying out one of these sketchbook portraits is to be able to simplify and not worry about too much of the detail. So things like her eyelashes are exactly the kind of thing that we will just treat as one slightly darker shape rather than trying to put in all the individual ones. But what you do have to do when you're simplifying is make decisions about what's going to be most important. So for example, on her little lips there, the important line is the one that separates her lips, because those are the ones that are giving us the shape of the smile. So I've got to be quite careful to put those in. And in the photo, she had very pale lipstick, and I'm not sure that's going to work for me in my portrait, so I'm going to give her a bit more lippy. Isn't it lovely to have that sort of power? Imagine walking down the street and fixing people's makeup to your liking as you go along. This is why we create, isn't it? Being an artist is so much fun. Now I'm just checking there with my finger to see if her eyes are dry, because one of the things that I want to be very careful about is painting her eyes. That is an area where I don't want any accidents, because it's going to be very hard to describe them as happy accidents if her eyeball ends up running into the bottom of her cheek, for example. So it felt a little bit cool to the touch, which means it's still damp. So instead of going into the eyes, which I'm itching to do because she's got that kind of zombie thing with, you know, white eyes like that woman from one of those sci-fi movies. I can't think of it. What's her name? It was Halle Berry played her, didn't she? Anyway, I digress completely. Not important. Let's talk about her hair. I'm going to make her a little bit more blonde. I think it's another great place to be using more than one colour, because hair is so reflective, isn't it? And she's got lovely shiny hair all over the place, so we want to give ourselves a chance to show some of those lighter tones. I've got a colour called Raw Sienna. That's one of my favourites for blonde hair. So I've put in a bit of that, and I'll let it settle a bit so that I can put in darker colours over the top and let little bits of it peep through. So I've got a colour called Van Dyke Brown, which I think is going to work quite nicely with the Raw Sienna to create this sort of golden hair colour that she's got. And I'm paying attention to the shadows that I identified earlier, which is the contact shadow where her beret is sitting on her hair. So I know it's going to be a bit darker there. And our hair actually also casts a shadow on our face. And that's, funnily enough, was one of the first things I put in, wasn't it? Was that brilliant red-violet shadow at the top. That's really what that is. It's the shadow that's created by her hairline. So I'm using one of my favourite brushes. I seem to have gone back to a set of Chinese brushes I've had for a while. To be honest, I think I've mistreated them and they could probably do with replacing. But they're really one of my favourites because they make such interesting shapes, and if you hold them straight up and down you get a very, very fine tip. But if you let the whole tip of the brush flatten down onto the page, you'll get a big fat juicy mark in a lovely random shape. So there's so much variety there, all just from that one brush. And on the side of her face there, when I paint the hair, it's actually a chance to firm up the jawline I gave her and the line of her cheek. So I'm trying to be careful to make sure that I preserve that lovely cheekbone that she's got. It's also what's showing that she's smiling, because her little cheek creates a kind of circle there, because as she smiles, her lips push her cheek up, and it's that's what gives you that lovely little curve as her face turns away from us slightly. Now hopefully those eyes are dry, because I'm bravely, and I'm trying to nurse the tip of my brush back into a point so that I can put in a nice fine mark for her eyes there. And I'm giving her green eyes. I think she had green eyes in her photo, but I think that's also going to be rather lovely with that red outfit she's got on today. I'm doing my best to preserve the highlight in her eyes by just not painting that bit of the paper. And that's why I really need to make sure that I've got that nice sharp point on the tip of my brush there. The eyeball is such a pretty thing, and that coloured part has always got more than one colour in it. And so what I was trying to do there was blot with my tissue paper, my kitchen towel, and that should create some variation. I think because the paint was quite thick and it has dried quite quickly, I'm not sure that was entirely successful, but you know, it's worth a go. And she's so tiny that it's the kind of detail that I'm not going to get too upset about if I miss out on, but it's always something I aim to do, is get some colour variation in that iris. Now I want to put in her eyelashes, which, as I said, I'm going to do all in one go. So this is where I'm going to be extra specially careful that it is all absolutely dry. And I choose not to have black paint in my palette. I think it's too harsh. You know, if you look at her little soft face, if you go and put a black line in there, in my opinion, it creates far too much contrast, and it doesn't give her that soft look that she currently, you know, kind of takes away the soft look that she currently has. So I'm using just one of the darkest colours. It doesn't really matter what it is. I think I went for neutral tint, but to make it as dark as possible, I need it to be concentrated paint, just like I did for when I was painting her eyeball. That'll also reduce the chances of it spreading out too much, but the main thing with that is making sure that it's dry. And our hands work in a particular curve, so it's usually much easier to draw one eye than the other. So I'm right-handed, and I find my curve works best from right to left with my right hand. So very often the left eye looks a little bit more wonky than the right eye, but you know, that's just life. So I turned the page to try and help myself out there. And you can see that just putting in that one dark line does tell us, we know that those are eyelashes. We don't need to see individual marks to know that those are her eyelashes. And I also took that same dark colour down into the centre of her iris so that I am suggesting the pupil. And again, I'm trying very carefully to keep that highlight because I can't get it back. If I really did, I could go in with a gel pen or something like that, and that might solve it, but it's best if I can just avoid painting over that little highlight area. And now I'm putting in her eyebrows, and those I have painted as individual hairs, kind of the way they grow, but I don't like that look, so I'm taking a slightly damp brush and kind of smushing some of those individual lines together so that they aren't looking quite like separate lines. And I'm using the same dark that I've got on my brush that I was using for her eyebrows to suggest her nostrils. And we don't want to make too much of that. It is one of the darkest parts of the face, but if you go to town on it, suddenly she can take on a cartoon piglet look, and she's so sweet and lovely. We don't want to do that to her now, do we? The nose is one of the bits that is always a little bit of a concern, so I take the approach that less is more. And while I've got that dark on my brush, the other dark part in the face is those little corners of the smile in her lip line and the separation between those two lips, the smile line. And it's nice to move that dark through the whole face so that it's not just sitting in one particular area. And there is a shadow that sits under the chin, but right now it's quite good that we're doing this in voiceover, because you can imagine I was not saying good things at this point. I did not really want a great giant purple beard on this poor lass. But we won't panic. We will put clean water over it gently, not a whole lot. If we put a whole lot of water over that, we will create all sorts of cauliflowers and destroy our good work underneath. But if we go calmly and gently, we can put in some clean water and gently dab at it with the kitchen towel and hope for the best. Because we do want a shadow there, so hopefully we've done it. Hopefully that will sort it out. So let's move away to another area and let it dry and see what we end up with. It's that shadow underneath the lip is what tells you that the lips are sticking out, and then there's a kind of another circular shape on the chin. And we also have the shadow that's being created because her head is turning away from us. So I'm using burnt sienna to kind of tone down that purple and to blend into the shadow that goes under her lip and round the side of her face as it turns away. Now, because I've made such a dark shadow under her lips, I'm feeling like I've lost the colour in those little lips, so let's pop that back in to kind of fix the balance there, because I don't want her to have as pale lips as she does in the reference photo. Right, now it's definitely time to move away from that poor old chin, because it's also worth remembering that with these sketchbooks, with the watercolour paper not being the same as proper watercolour paper, it doesn't take quite as much of a beating, so there's not as much wiggle room as you might have if you were using proper watercolour paper. So what I'm doing now is having a look at the face as a whole and seeing if I've missed any of the important darks. And one of the areas that we need, because it's what actually defines the nose for us, is the shadow that's created as her little head turns slightly away from us. So I'm using that lovely purple colour, the Brilliant Red Violet again, to lay in a little bit of extra shadow on the side of her nose, and it was the same colour I used to define her jawline between where the jaw and the top of her jumper is sitting, because that too, the head and the hair is creating a bit of a shadow, and because the face sticks forward, the neck sits further back and there's a shadow sitting on that neck. And some of her hair, that's one of the things we want to do last, because obviously the hair is sitting on top of the face, and her hair, she's got these lovely wispy tendrils that are sort of floating along in the breeze, and we want to put those in, and that's where this lovely Chinese brush I've got is going to do so much of the work for me. And it's probably even quite a good thing that it's an old brush that's taken a bit of a battering, because as those bristles split, it's kind of painting wispy strands of hair for me without me having to do much at all. Well, she makes me want to try a beret. How about you? Thanks for watching. See you next time.